Mike, thanks for being here. When did you decide that music could be a career?
Not till my mid-20s, really. I mean, I wanted to from a young age, but it just wasn't an option where I came from.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a small town, and there were no professional musicians. If I would have said I wanted to be an astronaut, I think my family would have said, okay, we can see how you get to there from point A to point B, but musician, no. Read Guitar Player magazines and snuck records and, had a fever for it, and I had a little band in high school, but we were, as most high school bands, we were not very good. And
what was your band name?
I think Warp Factor was one of the names.
Nice. Dude, I love the high school band names.
Yeah. Then I went on to community college, and I took a recording class in a real studio. I just thought it sounded interesting. And I went home and took my graduation money and my college money and bought a Stratocaster and a 4-track. It's the first cassette 4-track you could buy. And basically that's all I did in my free time, was just try to make little recordings and see how this works.
And at that point, were you doing it for fun, or were you starting to think about, well, how can I figure out how to make a living doing this?
It was all for fun, but I moved away from home, moved to Kalamazoo, Michigan, went to college, and started a band there. And we entered some Battle of the Bands and won we were kind of the big deal around there, and wanted to be the Rolling Stones and get a record deal and all that, and having no idea how that works.
Right.
At some point, I just was like, I've got to get my life together. Either I'm going to try to be a musician or not. Read about GIT out in LA, where you could go learn how to play guitar. Save some money, and my parents helped me out. I went out there. I thought, I'm going to go out here for a year and just play guitar. Then I'll figure out if I can do it or not. And it worked out.
Was there a moment where you had an experience where you saw someone really doing it that seemed possible?
I got to see a lot of people out there, Robin Ford and Larry Carlton and guitar players and session guys. Snuffy Walden was a guy who was doing TV shows, and he was a big deal. So it was like, yeah, this would be great, but these guys are awful good, and they can play anything. But one thing, when I was in LA, I did a lot of gigs. I worked all the time. I knew a lot of songs. I always wanted to play music wherever I could, and so I was always learning songs, no matter what kind of band I was in. Country music was starting to hit, and I hooked up with a songwriter. Somebody gave her my name, Jan Buckingham. She had written some hits in Nashville, and she had a place in LA and Nashville. She cut a record and needed a band, and I would go play for free with her.
So playing live was really a great way, it sounds like, to start meeting different folks and kind of getting into the circles around there and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I didn't know there was a such thing as a session musician till my mid-20s, right. Really.
So in that period of time where you're seeing these opportunities, you're just saying, yeah, I'll go play for free. It's a way to meet some folks and
I'll
stuff.
Play anywhere, anytime. And,
absolutely.
And I made a little money, but...
So in order to start moving away from having the part-time job during the day, playing the free gigs at night, what sort of pathway did you take to start kind of progressing through choosing what your value is to come and play a gig and choosing what gigs to play and finding that transition between just like the networking and the getting out and meeting folks and then getting to the point where, okay, this is my full-time profession and now I have a rate and I'm getting paid, a reasonable amount to come and play shows. That can be a challenging transition for musicians. How did you navigate that?
From the time I was about 19 through 25, 26, I made some money doing music, but never was enough to, I could pay the rent and barely get by. And until I moved to Nashville, I didn't really make a decent living at it. And
Gotcha.
But playing with this lady, Jan Buckingham, she was writing with a young songwriter, Odie Blackman, and we started hooking up and playing some gigs together as well. And one day she just said, man, you guys got to go to Nashville, the two of you. She's like, you guys don't belong out here. And I thought Nashville's closer to home. And let's give it a shot. So he and I drove cross country, moved to Nashville. And I was there 2 days. And Jan called and said, there's a group called the McCarter Sisters. They need a guitar player. Do you want to audition? So I was like, yeah. And I just went home and shedded. And it was bluegrass. It was way out of my league, but I busted my butt. went to audition, got the gig, and I was here 3-4 weeks, and my first gig was on the Opry.
That's
and from that point, I pretty much have made a living at music.
So it took about 7 years of hustling in LA, playing a bunch of shows, meeting a bunch of people, and then finally you found that sort of person that you didn't know in the moment, but now looking back, you can see was the catalyst that brought you there. And then that same person who suggested that you came here because of that relationship that you had with them, she was kind enough to throw you a bone and say, hey, there's this audition that you can do that led you into that. And it's just a really great example of how the career path of musicians so much different than, like, say, an electrician or a plumber or a doctor or lawyer, name any sort of normal job where you kind of you get your entry level thing, you kind of work. There's so much that just has to do with relationships and having the patience to allow just the universe to bring those people in front of you, while also making sure that you're executing each job that you do and doing well. And but it's making friends and getting to that point. There's a challenging way of differentiating the investment of your time into a really great opportunity or being around the right circle of people, while at the same time thinking about things in a more traditional way where you're like, well, my values should be this, and I'm not going to play a gig unless there's this, and there can be a bit of a challenging trade-off with it. For you, it sounds like you just dove in, any opportunity to get on a stage, play my instrument, and meet some people. Sounds like it's probably going to be moving me in the right direction, and it sounds like it absolutely did.
Backing up to, I had no musical upbringing or guidance, but living in this little farm town in Michigan, I was raised to have a great work ethic. So I just thought, man, I'll work harder than everyone else, hang out and watch how it's done, and go play whenever someone will have me. And which sort of leads to my next thing is I was playing with the McCarter sisters, and the keyboard player was playing a bar gig on the off night when we were in town down at the Opryland Hotel, and I would go down and sit in with him. Even though I had a road gig, I still wanted to learn and play. And one night this guy walks in, they introduced me to him. His name was Daryl Dodd, and he had just gotten a record deal, and he was playing guitar for Martina McBride. And he said, man, I heard you play, you should audition for Martina. I'm like, sign me up. So he gave me this guy's number, Brett Beavers, and went home, called Brett, got the audition, got the gig. And another thing, I was playing for free, hanging out in the right place, and you make your own luck a little bit.
So you had mentioned getting that McCarter Sisters gig where you weren't necessarily as comfortable with that style of music, yet you jumped into it because you're like, well, this is an opportunity, so I'm just going to figure it out. What did you need to do to be able to prepare to do that?
It was really bluegrassy, and I didn't grow up with that. So, I bought Tony Rice records and Clarence White records. And the funny thing is I didn't have a rehearsal with them either. And the keyboard player came over to my house and sat down with me to work out some of the stuff. And he said, and he saw me trying to struggle with some of these fast licks. And, and he was like, man, just start with the melody. To this day, last week I was working on a track and I was like digging myself a hole, couldn't get it. And then I was like, wait a minute, let me go back to the melody. And sure enough, it always works. To know the melody is the important thing. Mm-hmm. And then once you have that in your head, you can start to embellish it, play around it. That's just a great place to start all the time.
As much as there is that idea around just like say yes to everything, have there ever been any moments where you've recognized like, you know what, this thing actually just, it's not for me, and it's probably something that I should maybe turn down or point someone in a direction where someone might be a better fit? Because we often say, when you're getting started, you got to say yes to everything. But then there's also some really great examples that I've heard of from players throughout their career where they recognize, this thing probably isn't something that I should try to fake it, and maybe I'll be better off retaining this relationship if I suggest someone else or that sort of thing.
I'm game for anything. I will jump in and try anything, but there are some styles that I've just like, I love classic rock, but I'm not a heavy metal, that kind of shredder. And I would gladly recommend somebody else for that kind of gig. And a bluegrass gig, I can do some of that, but if it's flying by the seat of your pants, that's too much for me.
Mm-hmm. So you said that the sort of second gig that you got into was Martina?
Yes.
Gotcha. And then what was kind of the next pathway after that?
I was with her 3 years, did these Garth Brooks tours, toured Europe. I was young, single, living the life. It was a lot of fun.
Were there any things that you learned from one of those first like big, like, stadium tours where you look back and like, man, I wish somebody would have told me to expect this, to happen?
It's not the end all. If you want to grow as a person, you got to move from one thing to another. As a musician and a person, wasn't growing as a player a lot. I could play her stuff great, but the only time I was growing as a player was when I was home and playing other gigs and sessions and things like that.
Sometimes we maybe put the idea of an opportunity like that on a pedestal, like that would be sort of like the final goal, the destination to get to. But then once you're there, you recognize like, yeah, this is great, but there's still more to discover.
Gigs like that at that point in my life were more than I ever dreamed. So I kind of surpassed my musical dreams at a young age.
And what do you think it is about you as a musician and as a creative person that puts you kind of like in that category where, because there are some career paths where someone might say, this is a legacy gig. I'll do a great job. I'm going to be a part of this band. I'll be a part of this band for my career, and it's going to be my thing that I can kind of hang my hat on, and may do some other, side things, but this is great. I got this gig. I'm going to hang on to it for as long as I can, versus someone who gets a gig like that and then sees, this is awesome. I'm having a great experience, but I think there's more to do. There's more to be done.
I need a balance in my life. I like to play live. I like to do the studio. I like, stadiums were fun, but I'd rather play a bar, where people are listening and not bouncing beach balls. And that includes the studio, from doing demos to doing masters. There's some of the most musical moments in the studio have been on demos, and some of the most unmusical moments have been on masters, but I do enjoy it all.
Having the ability to be able to see the value of these different types of opportunities is really great. And I imagine something that helps you stay passionate and excited about things.
Yes. There's been a couple times over the years that I'm like, man, is this fun? And I was working for a studio really regularly for a long time, and I would come home and my wife would go, man, how was the sessions? And I'd be like, it was okay. Sort of found ways to keep myself inspired and passionate about it because, I love music. I love what I do. And it's a privilege to do what I do. Not many people get to do this. Yeah, it's a frame of mind. Even if I'm doing I work over at Eli's place at Beard quite a bit. And, we'll have some people come from out of town and never done this before. And you just turn their song into the greatest moment of their life. And they're sitting there, they're in tears. And what a gift we have to be able to do that for somebody.
Right. Even when something isn't necessarily on the marquee or on Billboard, this is something that can still be so fulfilling because of the impact that you're able to have with your instrument on someone's life. So where did the transition go from live to being in the studio full time?
Odie Blackman, the guy I moved to Nashville with, became a hit songwriter. He started using me on things. And then in Martina's band was Brett Beavers, who ended up writing a bunch of hits and producing Dierks Bentley. And
did you make a conscious decision that like now my career is going to be prioritized around studio sessions versus live? Do you make that like very clear distinction? Or some have the opinion of just kind of follow the gigs and, go where they're at. Most mention that it's very challenging to stay busy in the studio if you're on the road for a few months at a time because you're not able to really establish those relationships with producers that are calling and, building that rapport with them.
It's hard to do both. And I did it for years, but I always felt like, I was never fully in. And
so when you think about where those accounts started to come from, initially, where are some of the other ways that you started getting introduced to potential clients that were going to bring you in on a session?
Roommate Odie, when we moved here, he would go do these writers' nights and I'd go play with him for free. And eventually he started using me on demos, and some of the other writers I got to know, and they would start using me on stuff. And then also I got married in 97, and my wife, soon after we got married, she got a publishing deal. We had a little studio and he loved what we did. And then pretty soon some of the other writers at the publishing company would, she would co-write with them. They'd come over to the studio and I started doing their stuff.
So it sounds like make friends with a lot of songwriters or marry a songwriter. And then
yeah, that helped.
So when you started diving into the sessions, what are some of the skill sets that you recognized that were important to really lock in that was different from what you needed to do live?
Yeah, I mean, you're under the microscope. You know, live, you're learning a record. You're learning somebody else's parts, which are great. It's a great skill to be able to do, and a great learning process to learn how records are made. You know, when I was learning Brent Mason licks and all that stuff, I'm like learning their thought process while you're learning their licks. And I played electric in all the touring bands, actually. Started to develop a bad back, so I started not wanting to haul my electric gear around and just started playing it more acoustic. And then I realized the acoustic chair, you know, sometimes it's the hot seat.
Why do you say that?
Well, most writers write on acoustic. So they come in, you know, usually you got to start by copying what they do. And hopefully they will allow you to try to make it better. Sometimes these writers develop these unorthodox techniques and you got to try to cop that, you know. And
when a songwriter comes in and they have a way that they've been used to playing it and hearing it, you know, they really want your expertise and, you know, you to do something. Then they hear that and they're like, oh, it just doesn't sound right, you know, and you recognize, well, I got to figure out that interesting voicing or that open string that they're letting ring, you know, that sort of thing. What sort of process have you learned to go through to be able to figure that out? If someone, you got to really copy what somebody's playing and it's totally different than how you would do it.
First of all, I try to make myself familiar with as many styles of music as I can and what's going on with records these days. But if I'm in the session and somebody comes in like that, I have two things. I'll either record it on my phone, and while I'm walking to my acoustic booth, I'll sort of listen to it a couple times, or I'll have them show me. I'll say, man, just show me what you're doing. And that 9 times out of 10, that works.
Are there any sort of like obvious adjustments that you make to help something sound better on a record versus if you're just sitting in the writing room and strumming your guitar?
A lot of them will play with their hands, you know, maybe not using a pick. A lot of them will tune down a half step or a whole step because it plays better. For me to tune my guitar down a whole step, the intonation's out. So,
but you know that your guitar pitch center wise is going to sing better if it's at the position where, you know, it's tuned to. So now you figure out where you need to play that part. Also, maybe a challenging thing for someone that's kind of like just getting into recording to hear the way a songwriter's playing it and then try to figure out, transpose in their mind, well, how do I get that, you know, that same thing without tuning my guitar down?
Yeah, sometimes, you know, just playing in a different position will take care of that. And if they're open to that, other times they'll come in with a lick and they're tuned down a whole step. I got to play the lick. So I got to tune to where they're tuned. And then sometimes the singer's like, let's even drop it another half step or whole step. So I have a baritone guitar that can go down, and it's not my favorite guitar to play, but if worse comes to worse, that will usually cover that ground.
If there ends up not being another alternative, you have a guitar that's already kind of tuned in a way that will allow you to pull it up and the intonation will be right and kind of cop what they were doing.
Yeah. And some days guitar players will come in and you can tell they wrote everything tuned down a whole step. So I'll leave one guitar, I'll tune it down at the beginning of the session, or a half step or whatever. I'll tune it to where they do and just leave it there for the whole session. So
when you're in a session environment like that, songwriter comes in with the idea and you kind of have an approach that you feel like is going to, you know, help it land. A lot of times songwriter loves it. They're like, that's great. You know, you're bringing it to life. In the cases where they're not loving it, but they're not really sure how to explain what it is that they're going for. The vocabulary of music can be so many different dialects, you know, where we're saying the same thing, but we're using entirely different words. How have you learned to sort of navigate those conversations?
Try to figure out where they're coming from. But I've had other musicians, you know, on the session that get where they're coming from. And they'll say to me, man, Wally, do that. That's what they're wanting. And then it'll click. They have a way of communicating it to me that maybe the songwriter didn't. And I'm thankful for any guidance I can get.
And that's also something that maybe have you done in situations where someone's, you know, artist is trying to explain that to another player and you're like, oh, I think I understand what they mean. And you voice it in the dialect that they're going to understand, you know? Yeah,
we all have our strong points and we all get different kinds of music. If this is something I've grown up playing and I know this music and the keyboard is not quite getting it, you know, what do you do with your left hand? Well, that's what you do. And some days I have the heavy lifting, some day it's the keyboard player, and sometimes it's the drummer they wear out.
Yeah.
Which I'm happy with. Go ahead and wear out the drummer. They deserve it.
Right. Yeah, music is a team sport. for sure.
Definitely.
So there's also a nuance, I guess, to it though, when with that communication, because you don't want to step on anybody's toes. So there's like this careful balance of wanting to support the artist, support the producer, support your fellow comrades on the floor, while also respecting everyone's expertise in their own, situation. Were there ever any experiences that you had where unintentionally, you learned a lesson on, I probably should have approached this way and it would have helped move that, situation along better?
I mean, there's times I wish I would have kept my mouth shut. Everyone can't say what they want at the same time because there's not enough time. So, you got to have confidence to do what you're doing, but you got to be ready to change like that. And most of the session musicians are great at that. They don't take it personal. Mm-hmm. I've heard guys lay down something which I thought was great, and the songwriter go, "No, that's not it." And I'm like, "Man, what you played was great." And they're like, "No big deal. I'll just do what they want."
How do you maintain that mentality as you start to? You've clearly climbed to the top of the mountain. You're there. You're being hired for the great gigs and stuff. And then someone who arguably maybe is less of an expert at your craft than you are is telling you that that's not right. As much as we want to say, yeah, of course, it's great, we'll go do something else, there's that little thing in the back of our minds that for most people that are still kind of feeling that way. Are there any things that you've sort of learned when that voice starts to creep up to kind of like remind yourself and pull you back in to make sure that even that you're not even unintentionally giving off a negative sort of reaction in those situations? Yeah.
They've hired me for a reason, but I'm also here to serve. There's also times I learn from those situations. This is not the way I would do it, but I'm learning something new here. And sometimes they're just right. Sometimes they're wrong, but you got to let them, they're paying the bills. They wrote the song. They're producing it. It's their deal.
I love that idea of looking at it from the perspective of, even if this isn't what I would have done, I have an opportunity here to learn something new, whether I'm going to use it, again or not, but more than likely it's going to be some sort of new idea that can maybe be applied at some point, instead of just kind of like quieting that thing and just saying, well, I'm not supposed to get upset because that's what we're supposed to do and just serve. You're looking at it from not just that fundamentally, but like, oh, this is also an opportunity to learn something new and grow.
Yeah, it helps to have that attitude. And a lot of times, if they're pointing me in a direction I'm not comfortable with, or they're playing me something, I'll record it and without them knowing it. And I'll go home and work on it. If this is not comfortable for me now, it may need to be comfortable. I may need to learn this.
Mm-hmm. So how much time do you spend practicing these days?
As much as I can. I've always done a lot of it. When I lived in LA, I played guitar 16 hours a day. I had no personal life. Now I have a family and sessions. But on a regular session day, I will get up at 7 and practice for an hour or two in the morning. And
mm-hmm. What do you practice?
Really, I have some just finger exercises I've found over the years, collected, but I do them really slow without the TV on or the computer or anything, so I can really focus on when I'm doing this. I'm making some noise, and how do I not do that? And if you do it real slow, you can sort of figure it out, and it sort of seeps into your playing. I'm focusing on the smallest things.
Yeah, those are the little details that you'd never notice live, or you often wouldn't notice live. And you may not even notice, as you mentioned, while you're tracking, but the mixing engineer is going to notice. And then when you add up that with 3 or 4 parts, and those little things are happening now, when everything is really clear and, present in the mix, now if those little things aren't paid attention to, now there's a lot of fixing, or the part gets replaced because it wasn't, clean enough. But you may not notice that while you're playing unless you're really focused in on those little details.
Yeah, and if you want to listen to the whole mix. You want to be listening to everything, the lyric, the vocal, the groove, and to get into the song. So you can't just be listening to yourself. Mm-hmm. And I've engineered myself enough to know that when I go back and solo myself up, there's a lot of times, it's like, I apologize to all the engineers in this town that have soloed me up and heard me panning and string noise or grunting or whatever. I work on it. But
so it sounds like your focus is you practice these things outside of sessions, so that way you don't have to think as much when you're on the session and it's more just playing so you can be immersed in the song itself.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you don't want to be thinking.
When you're doing that practice, are there any specific licks, or what exactly are you playing when you're listening for those?
Like finger stretching exercises that'll really stretch them out. Little hammer on, pull off tech things, that sort of things you take for granted, and you think you've got it down. But then when you put it under the microscope, you're like, this can be better and cleaner. And
Mm-hmm. Well, are there any other things that you practice on a regular basis?
Rhythms. I practice just my right hand rhythms, different patterns,
What are you sort of trying to improve upon when you're practicing different right hand rhythm patterns?
Yeah, if I'm playing something at 80 beats per minute, or like that's a quarter note, playing along with it, you cut that in half to 40. And so you're not hearing the metronome as much. You're only hearing half of it. So your playing has to be more accurate because you're be there when it comes back around. Then you cut that in half. And
so you're taking a tempo and then removing the subdivision between it. So instead of a quarter note, it'd be a half note. And instead of a half note, it'd be a bar.
Yes.
And you're staying in time with that so you can internalize the rhythm.
Get that in your
tighter.
head. Yeah. But also I've learned just recently in the last few years to doubling it up, because if you're doing this with a quarter note, you can still have some laziness in there. That doubling it up at a faster metronome, sometimes that helps to get rid of some of the little lazy.
Yeah. So hearing like the eighth note on the metronome is going to be a way that's going to probably support you a little bit more, where now you have more subdivision in it. So you're hearing it, which is helping. When you cut it in half, you're sort of doing the opposite. You can't hear it, so you have to like really, internalize it.
Yeah.
I imagine, at a certain point, for many people, the practice isn't necessarily as fun. It's like, well, I'm practicing on the job all day, but it sounds like you've really focused in on. There's always something new to learn. There's always something that we can refine, and the opportunity to be able to see that we can grow and get better is also a way to stay excited.
Don't forget, listening to music is important too, and I have to remind myself to just get away from my instrument for a little bit and get in the car and just go listen to a record. Or
So looking back, were there any artists that you worked with that you just really remember learning something special from?
I spent a day in the studio with Jon Bon Jovi, and it was 2 songs for a soundtrack for a movie. And they were doing something a little more acoustic-y. Jakiri King was producing. Anyway, we came into the studio, and he knew everybody's name, all the session guys. He's like, oh, yeah, I know about you. We got in there and for 10 hours recorded 2 songs, and he played guitar and sang live, and he worked harder than any of us. And when I left that session, I'm like, that's obvious why this guy is a big deal. He's put in the work, just learned a lesson about hard work. He probably could have cut the songs by himself, and it could have made the movie because it was that good. And that was a challenge, to try to add something to the song, but not be overbearing and let it be what it is.
When you're on a session with an artist who's also an instrumentalist and, playing, are there any things that you sort of learn or take away from the difference between the approach of, say, a seasoned session player versus an artist that's coming in and playing, that's sometimes maybe a helpful reminder or something that has been helpful to learn?
Unorthodox ways of playing, or keeping it simple, or it doesn't have to be perfect. Sometimes you do learn that from artists. It's like, we want to capture the song and we want to capture the vibe, and look at all the great songs over the years that you can listen to, and you can hear a car honking, or you can hear a mistake or whatever. But the record's still good. It's about the performance. It's not about your part. It's not about you. It's not about being perfect. It's about creating some magic.
So references is a really fun topic.
Yes.
And it kind of goes back to that sort of, everyone has a different dialect and there's a musical language, but you can say it in so many different ways. There's so many times where the reference is vaguely relevant to the song. Now there's many times where the artist says the reference and I'm like, oh yeah, solid. That makes sense. I get it. In those cases where they're saying, I want this, but they really just mean they want the spirit of it. Are there any sort of things that you've learned about how to discover what it is that they actually, mean by it, or how to pull that out?
Sometimes it's really obvious. They'll say, we want this, and you're like, okay, we get it. We know exactly what you want. But then, other times they wrote a waltz and they want, they're like Jason Aldean. And we're like, what? But even then, maybe it's the instrumentation or something. Maybe they're wanting a rock guitar. Maybe they just wanted a little more modern sounding than what they wrote it. Yeah, I mean, they're saying that for a reason. So you try to figure out what can you get out of here that they're trying to tell you.
When it comes to like instruments that you're gonna bring on a session and figuring out which ones are good for recording.
There's some guitars that sound amazing on their own, like a Loudon or some $8,000 acoustic, which is not what really going to be the best thing for a mix. Maybe a real focused Gibson J45 is going to pop out of a, just fill that sonic space. One of the best sounds I've ever had on a record was a cheap Epiphone from the 80s I found in a pawn shop. And the engineer just got a great sound on it, and it's got a certain sonic space, and it filled it, and it did a little finger picking thing on it, and it sounds amazing.
What are the go-to like kind of mainstay guitars that you would bring on a session?
I have a couple bourgeois guitars. One's a D18 model. It's called a Country Boy. Another one's an OM model. I have a J45, a Martin D28. It's an old one, but it's kind of funky sounding. So not every session. Harmony Sovereign that this guy down in Alabama builds them. A lot of sessions guys have them now. A 60s guitar, not a real popular guitar, but this guy's rebuild them, and they're great. Got those. I have a high string, a baritone, a 12 string, a gut string, a banjo, a mando, a bouzouki. And if I don't bring it on a session, somebody's going to ask for it. I normally haul all that stuff around or have Cartage do it.
Was there ever a experience that you had or a session that you were on that helped you learn that lesson of bringing everything? Because if you don't, someone's going to ask for it.
Yeah, I was playing on a Hillary Scott record with Ricky Skaggs producing, and I was playing electric on this album and didn't even have a thought. I didn't bring any acoustic gear and didn't even have a thought to bring a banjo. And we get to one song, and he said, after lunch, we're going to be doing this other song, and you played banjo on the demo. He goes, did you bring it? I'm like, no, I didn't bring it because I'm playing electric, and there's 4 guys in this room that can play banjo better than me. I hadn't touched one in weeks. He goes, well, go home and lunch and get it. So I went home and lunch and got it while everyone else is eating, and I came back, and I'm like, I feel so uncomfortable playing this right now. Yeah, that was a hard lesson.
So you've had a few decades of experience going through this, making records, playing great shows, awesome tours and stuff. When you sort of like, look back on that, and as you were progressing into it and as things started kind of taking off, what do you wish you would have known or somebody would have told you?
In a way, I think not to take things quite so serious and quite to heart, because this business will beat you up, still beats me up now and then. I'll have days where I come home and go, why would anyone hire me? And then I find out, that everyone has these moments. Even my heroes, these guys that I've worshipped, and I find out they have anxiety about sessions and things. Not every day is going to be a good day. Just try to have thick skin and put it behind you and do better next time.
I think it's also a part of just wanting to excel at a really high level. I feel like when that's something that's bound to happen when you have high aspirations of doing something, really well, which is what gets you into that place. But it's rare that it's kind of, talked about. We're kind of on our own with it because, no one wants to be the one to bring it up. So I think it's really great to have more conversations about the challenges that come with this, this job and working through it.
It was never talked about until recently. And now, I do talk about it with guys.
Was there ever a point where you really thought about what success means?
Man, to be able to play guitar for a living.
And then once you're able to do that, so you're playing guitar for a living, and then you get this incredible gig, and now you're touring the world with an artist and playing stadiums. Then at that point, do you say, okay, I'm successful now? How does the idea of success continue to evolve as your career has progressed?
Well, yeah, you're always shooting. You're always climbing the ladder and shooting for something else. It's just natural. You have to be grateful and mindful of what you're doing, or you won't enjoy it. If I look back at 18-year-old Mike, to be playing guitar at all for a living. If I was playing at the Holiday Inn every night, I would have thought, man, that's awesome. There's not very many people get to do what I do. Go into the studio every day and play guitar.
Yeah, I think thinking that way is a great way to stay grounded as career grows. I know, at least for me, I've had these experiences where you hit like the milestones that you've been after. And then you thought that getting to that point, you'd feel more confident or more accomplished or whatever. But then that becomes the norm. So now that that's the norm, you see what the next possibility is. And you've already accomplished far beyond what your 18-year-old self or 12-year-old self would have ever wanted, to be able to feel content. But now that sort of excitement wears off. Like, we're not holding on to the wins long enough or strong enough, because we just feel like we have to continue to validate ourselves through, those continued, sort of things. And it sounds like you've found the mindset of being able to stay grateful in the foundation of why you started doing it in the first place.
Being in a musical family, my wife and my kids are in the business. Sometimes we'll remind each other, when we see us just going through the motions or getting kind of like, what am I doing with my life? We'll remind each other, you've done a lot of stuff,
right?
And you're still doing it.
If there was an attribute that you could kind of pull out from maybe something that you had to work on in the early days that has become something that you recognize as maybe a differentiator that's helped you succeed for an extended period of time?
Well, I think I've been thrown into a lot of gigs that I really wasn't ready for, but some reason I got the gig. I tell my kids jokingly, but seriously, show up on time, play in tune, and be cool to get along with, and your phone will ring. And there's a lot of truth to that. And yeah, I showed up. I was going to work hard. They could see that right off the bat. I had a lot of fun on the road with bands. I still have a lot of fun with the guys in the studio, and hopefully I'm somebody they want to have around.
What was the most powerful piece of advice that you remember from those early days with mentors sharing something with you?
One that sticks out to me, and he would not remember this, but Mike Rojas, who I've always looked up to as a great musician, and I still do. We were actually playing a gig, and after the gig, we were having a beer, and he said, man, I just want to tell you, I hear something really special in your playing. And at that point, I was getting kicked around, and I was like, do I go back on the road? Do I do studio work? Am I good enough to do this? And thanks, Mike. It stuck with me, and what a great thing to say to somebody.
And a great reminder to support our peers,
Yeah.
And when you're seeing something great, or if you see somebody that's, that's struggling with something, or just in general, just to, to sort of give that feedback and affirmation, because all of us are kind of on an island on our own trying to figure it out.
And we all go through
a long way.
Go through stuff. I every day I go in the studio, I try to talk to everybody a little bit. And sometimes guys are struggling. Sometimes you're the guy that's struggling. And just encourage each other. And
opening up those conversations and those topics and kind of creating a community around the world of session playing is a lot of what inspired us to create this. You told us so many incredible stories and insights today. I absolutely loved it, man.
Well, thanks for having me. I loved watching these little clips, and I'm still learning from watching your podcast and watching what you're doing here.
Well, thanks, man. We learned a lot today. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.